Class is now in session 9, Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the performance of number 48, Tomas Hertl. So Hertl had a complete breakthrough year, a fantastic year for himself. On the first year of his new contract, he had signed an extension 4 years at around $4.6 million. And in this first year, he had a huge career year for himself. So his frequent line mates during the regular season, he found himself with Kane and Donskoy. This was the second line prior to the arrival of Gustav Nyquist, but technically it spent more time as this than it did with Nyquist. And in the playoffs, it was Hertl with Kane and Pavelski. This was the line that was together for the majority of the St. Louis Blues series prior to injuries in Game 6, as well as that Game 7 against the Colorado Avalanche. Once Pavelski returned and Nyquist had solidified his spot on that top line with Couture and Meyer, this was the second line moving forward. Now, in the regular season, Tomas Hertl played 77 games, missing a few due to injury, got 35 goals, 39 assists, and 74 points, career highs in all three of those stats. Fantastic year for him, putting up that many points. I mean, 74 is certainly nothing to scoff at. Even if scoring was up slightly league round, you definitely would not have necessarily been expecting this as a massive breakthrough year, and yet here we are. A +5 for him, certainly nothing to write home about, but obviously it's nice to see to be in the positives. 15 power play points, which is interesting because this actually puts Hertl at the tops for Sharks forwards in terms of even strength points with 57, a couple of points ahead of Timo Meier, who was sort of noted to have that even strength point advantage. So it was nice to see that Hertl was not only contributing on the power play, his 15 power play points is still quite solid, but also putting up a ton of production at even strength. His time on ice was just about 19 minutes, which is pretty high for a forward, only a couple of seconds behind Joe Pavelski for first place in terms of forwards in the regular season. He was also near the tops in terms of shorthanded ice time, in terms of power play ice time, and of course in terms of even strength ice time. So just to show that Tomas Hertl has played in basically every single situation. If the Sharks are down a goal, if the Sharks are up a goal, if the Sharks are tied, basically everything, you can just toss Tomas Hertl onto the ice. He's also pretty good in terms of face-offs as a centerman on that second line, and so he is playing second line, but he's certainly not just a second line center. You could probably have him as a first line center on most teams in the NHL besides those that have like McDavid or Crosby. Next in the playoffs is where he had a bit more trouble, but it was still quite solid. 19 games played, only missing that final game of the playoffs, Game 6 against the St. Louis Blues, due to that hit to the head from Ivan Barbashev. He got 10 goals and 5 assists for 15 points, so it obviously looks quite solid, 15 points in 19 games, but the issue with Hertl during the playoffs is that a lot of those points came in just a few games. For instance, 12 of his 15 points, so 80% of his points came in just 6 games, about 33% of the games he played, and so there were just a few too many where Tomas Hertl didn't really show up, especially in that series against the Blues. He played 5 games. He only had a single point, so that was a bit disappointing to see. But again, that's somewhat nitpicky for a player who ended up with 15 points in 19 games and 10 goals to go with that. He was obviously huge in a lot of games, like against the Golden Knights, Game 7, and especially Game 6 with the overtime winner. So again, it wasn't an awful playoffs for Hertl. It wasn't even like a subpar or even average. It was still quite good, but it wasn't at the level that it was at in the regular season, especially that Hertl is a player who's sort of built for the playoffs. You were maybe expecting a bit more of a consistent performance. His plus-minus put him at +2, which is pretty decent. 7 power play points, which is actually kind of nice to see, considering that only 2 of those 7 actually came in that Game 7 against the Golden Knights. And since the Sharks' power play was actually kind of meh during the entirety of the playoffs, the fact that Hertl had 5 power play points throughout the rest of the games was actually pretty decent. And his time on ice was a massive 21 minutes and 52 seconds. The only other Sharks forward who had even above 20 minutes was Logan Couture, and Hertl was a good minute and a half above Couture. He was again near the tops in terms of power play ice time. In terms of shorthanded ice time, I believe he was even first. In terms of even strength ice time, he was close to the top as well. And so there were even some games in which Hertl was getting above 30 minutes of ice time. You know, point to that Game 6 against the Golden Knights, even the Game 7 against the Golden Knights. Tomas Hertl played over 30 minutes. So again, it just goes to show that especially in the playoffs, since he is built for a game like that, DeBoer is very, very willing to toss Tomas Hertl off onto the ice at any point in any game whatsoever. So it's always good to have a forward like that instead of, maybe some of the other top forwards in the NHL who maybe you can't put on shorthanded. You can't necessarily rely on them when up a goal or something in the last minute. And Hertl is a player who you can't do that with. Next, for his grades, of course, you could definitely make the argument Tomas Hertl was the regular season MVP for the Sharks. You could likely definitely say that he was the Sharks forward MVP at the very least. Only Brent Burns would likely come close to, contesting Tomas Hertl for that MVP spot. But in the first quarter, he got the grade of an A, even when the Sharks weren't that great during that first quarter. The second quarter, a slight fall off with the A-. Then the third quarter and fourth quarter, both A again. Even in that fourth quarter where the Sharks were really quite bad, Tomas Hertl still managed to be the forward with the most points during that time period. Only the playoffs were maybe his, I guess you could say, worst time during the during this entirety of the season, just because of a lack of consistency at times during the playoffs. But he still got a relatively solid B+, and as such, his final grade will end up with a very strong A. Likely, of the players I've already reviewed thus far during this offseason, Tomas Hertl probably had the best season, and we'll see. It's likely he'll try and sustain this production. I believe it'll actually be very possible for him to sustain this production going into the following year. Class dismissed.